Welcome, everyone. It is 2 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., and I want to welcome you all to the latest in the series of our 20th anniversary webinar shows for the 20th anniversary of Public Knowledge. I'm Chris Lewis. I'm the President and CEO of Public Knowledge. We really appreciate everyone joining us via the Zoom webinar, or those of you who are watching with the live stream or perhaps a recorded stream of us on YouTube. We have a wonderful YouTube channel where you can find the entire catalog of not only Public Knowledge's videos over the years, but this specific series of our 20th anniversary Public Knowledge webinar. So please check those out. But for the next hour, we're going to be talking about a really fun topic in the history of public knowledge. And we have a really expert panel of public knowledge alums joining us for it as well. The topic is emerging tech through the years at Public Knowledge. And, one of the things I love about working here is that Public Knowledge not only does great advocacy work, deep policy analysis work, but when we're at our best, we are thinking ahead and talking about the issues of innovation and new technology in a way that really can shape the debate for the future. Public Knowledge always supports the development of innovation, and but when we talk about innovation, we want to make sure that that innovation technology is open and inclusive, especially for independent voices and marginalized communities. And this has been true about the development of our emerging technology series, emerging technology conferences, and topics over time. And so let me introduce our wonderful panel that's joining us. We're going to talk to them in order and then as a group. But first, our oldest PK alum joining us is Michael Weinberg, who is currently the Executive Director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy at NYU Law School. He is a former Vice President at Public Knowledge. Also with us is Courtney Duffy, who is currently serving as the Head of Creator Policy Engagement at Patreon, a wonderful technology company. Courtney served as an Arts and Technology Fellow at Public Knowledge a few years back. And last but not least, we have joining us Elisa Valentin. Elisa is currently serving as the Special Advisor to FCC Commissioner. He's going to love that I said that. FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks, where she's been serving the last couple of years. But Elisa was our very first Communications Justice Fellow at Public Knowledge. So welcome, one and all. We're glad to have you. And I'm going to start off the conversation by talking with Michael. First of all, Michael, you preceded me at Public Knowledge. You wrote about multiple emerging technology topics, and you also developed and co-founded one of what became Emerging Tech DC, but was founded as 3D DC. Can you tell us a bit about how you got the idea to create that conference, and what sort of work went involved to thinking about that specific type of emerging technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I'll have to get my Public Knowledge walker and ear horn ready for the oldest alum. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of that work came out of this idea that Public Knowledge is a special place. One of the things that makes PK special is that it is at that intersection of really understanding law, really understanding what policymakers understand and don't understand, and then also being really connected to the public interest into what's happening out in the world. And so while PK is always good at sort of fighting the current fight, it also has the capacity to anticipate things that are happening or going to happen in the future. And so one of the ideas behind that conference was to say, okay, well, what can we do to anticipate a potential set of issues that might be relevant in the future? And what can we do to frame that for policymakers and begin to connect people in the community who are involved in that thing with policymakers? Because we used to say to people, look, you don't want your first meeting with a policymaker to be, there's a huge problem, and I need to spend the first half hour of this meeting just explaining to you what this technology is. You want to make sure that when there is a problem, you've already had that first, hey, this is what's going on conversation. And so we did the first 3D DC, which then was followed actually by an open hardware DC and then back to 3D DC. All of those were designed to just familiarizing people in the DC policy world with all of these different emerging technologies so they could begin to think about them and understand them in context before there was some crisis that taught them about them.
Great. And so the technology at that time, 3D printing may have been new to folks in Washington, but the technology itself wasn't new. What was so innovative and emerging that you felt like it was important to introduce that specific technology?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that was happening in 3D printing at that time was that the initial patents were expiring. And so a technology that had been very expensive and business focused was suddenly becoming open and cheap and available to all sorts of people. And so there was a sort of sea change happening with the technology where all of a sudden it was being much more democratized. And so people began to think, well, what does it mean if you have this little factory in your house or in your office or in your makerspace? And what impacts could that have on different kinds of policy? And the sort of first step in that examination is to just say, look, this is what this technology is right now. These are the people who are involved with it. Here's what it can do. Here's what it can't do. And so if you want to be thinking about it, have a nuanced understanding of what that technology really is, so we can have a starting point that makes sense and is grounded in reality, not in sort of fears about what could be or what was possible, but actually isn't happening anytime soon. And so I think that really helped people on both on the community side and on the policymaker side just begin to understand the technology outside of a crisis and to really understand a more nuanced set of the context surrounding what's happening.
One more, Michael, before we turn to Courtney and then Lisa. You mentioned open hardware DC, which came after the first 3D DC event. For folks who may follow public knowledge for other topics, but not necessarily these topics, how do you explain the difference and also the interconnection between the 3D printing makerspace community and the open hardware community that I know you're passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, they're very closely related, right? That democratization of 3D printing technology basically happened because, as I said, those patents expired and an open community of people said, well, okay, let's work together to make this technology cheaper and more effective and better, and then share openly and coordinate. And so the 3D printing world is a really good example of what happens when open technology works. But open technology is much broader than that. And it's very much related to the open source software ethos and this idea that people all over the world can collaborate and improve and really make and localize hardware just as they've done with software. And that openness really fuels quality and helps identify all sorts of new applications for either new technology, for existing technology that hasn't been brought to specific communities.
Fantastic. So Courtney, I want to turn to you next because you had a big task when you came on as an arts fellow with us. And in doing so, you picked up the reins from Michael and also shout out to Martin Griffin, who's not here, but was also a big part of working with Michael and I know overlapped with you, Courtney. But how did you end up picking up the reins on this conference and this work? Tell us how you came introduced to it.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris and Michael and Elisa. It's great to be with you both. Yes, indeed. Michael and I really were ships passing. I think he had just departed PK when I came aboard. And so it was into his considerable shoes that I was stepping to lead 3DDC in the year that would have been its 5th anniversary, which is a big deal. So it was really important to me to kind of build on Michael's original vision rather than scrap it and start anew. But whereas Michael was an expert when it came to 3D printing, a wonk really, I was brand new to it. So I sort of charted this crash course for myself where I mean, like if you had ever sneezed in the direction of a 3D printer, I was at your doorstep and wanted to hear everything you could possibly tell me, and then ask you who else you could introduce me to. So it was along that journey that I met past panelists and attendees, but also, folks who ran maker spaces, professors, artists, you name it. And I just remember thinking, I'm not a member of Congress and I'm not a member of the 3D printing community, but I found myself really caring about this stuff. So it occurred to me that an additional target audience that we could kind of look into and adjust the event to in this next step of its journey was others like me who are generally optimistic towards technology and believe in the free exchange of ideas over the internet. So in my 2 years at the helm, my vision really was to demonstrate this wide-ranging set of applications and implications that this emerging technology sort of offered. And so the panels spanned from 3D printing in the human body. We had 3D print, the future of the maker movement in the new Trump administration, extreme applications of 3D printing, and 3D printing and the arts, which was my bread and butter, and of course the topic of my fellowship. So Michael, despite being in the throes of a new role, he was then at Shapeways, was so generous with his time, and it really helped me shepherd his event forward without compromising, the magic that made it what it was.
Great. And I know you just described how you got to meet so many folks. We have a hardcore 3D printing following that I hope is watching today and still reads Public Knowledge's work, but they showed up every year and we all got to meet them, young and old, from around the country, and especially here in the Washington, D.C. area, folks who could drive and show up, really interesting people. For folks who are watching, I will encourage you to start to put some of your questions. If you have questions for our panelists about their work, both in the past and in the future, we'd love to open it up to you guys as the hour goes on. So please use the Q&A function. I believe we have the chat disabled, but the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom can be used to write a question, and we can select from any of the questions that you write in. But to keep the conversation going, Courtney, so 3DDC really grew. You brought artists to the table, you brought more diverse topics to the table. We also had a very robust Hill Advocacy Day or Hill Day while you were running 3DDC. I think we started that with Michael, but it got fairly comprehensive during your 2 years. What can you tell us about that experience, and what are some of the challenges of bringing people to Washington to talk about new technology?
Yes, I learned pretty quickly in my fellowship at PK that it's one thing for me or someone on the government affairs team to sit in a congressional office and make a case for XYZ legislation, no matter how important it may be, but it's a whole other ballgame when you have creators or makers themselves in that room telling their authentic stories. So indeed, the day before our main 3DDC event, we held an advocacy workshop for members of the 3D printing community and hosted them at the PK office that morning and really focused on arming them with the communication skills that they would need to tell that compelling, authentic story, not just in the halls of Congress, where we brought them later that afternoon, but also back home in their own, constituencies, speaking with their own, elected officials. So it was a logistical challenge for sure. It certainly helped immensely that we had the backing of Representative Mark Takano and his then Deputy Chief of Staff, Yuri Beckelman, who together ran the Congressional Maker Caucus. I recall vividly too how every person on PK's staff really stepped up that day, whether it was to train advocates, guide them around the Hill, moderate a panel for me. Chris, I think you did that once or twice for me. So it was one of my favorite examples, I think, of how little old PK can really punch way above its weight class. It took all hands on deck, and it's not something I'll soon forget.
Yeah, and definitely thank you to Congressman Takano. I believe, if I recall, the Maker Caucus was a combination of Yuri and Martin Griffin's idea. Martin on our Gov Affairs team, and we really were able to build some allies from folks who understood the technology and wanted us to continue to share new technology with other members of Congress. So Courtney, you left public knowledge, oh gosh, I want to say 2016, 2017.
Yes, 2017.
Okay. And so when you moved on, we wanted, and we did keep the 3D printing event going. But, after a few years, 3D printing was a bit better known in Washington. Other events had popped up. I think there was a DC Maker Caucus. I think the White House had a Maker event as well. And so while we had the first 3D printing event in Washington, we were not alone anymore. And so, one mission accomplished. We helped bring awareness of the technology to policymakers in Washington. And so we shifted to emerging tech. The combination of 3D printing, yes, our hardcore audience, but also 3 other emerging technologies that were new on the scene or developing in a way that presented challenges and appropriate questions for the public interest community. So we're thinking of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making that goes with it. We think of virtual reality, which was definitely a fun technology to add, and the Internet of Things. And with that, we created, or we shifted 3D DC to emerging tech DC. And I believe that's about the point, the year after we first did that was when Elisa joined our team. So Elisa, we're gonna turn the story to you. You came on as our first Communications Justice Fellow, which I know I was really excited about because folks don't know Elisa. She really helped the public knowledge team to start to think and incorporate the importance of communities of color into our work in a way that, to be fair, I don't think we had been doing as well as we should have. And it's something we continue to work on today. Elisa, you did it in your writing, you did it in your advocacy, but you also did it with this event. Tell us about how you transformed Emerging Tech DC.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today, Chris, and thanks to the PK team. I know Michelle's in the background, and Meredith helps out a lot with all these events. You guys have been doing a lot of virtual events during the pandemic. But to answer your question, just like Courtney said, I built on the foundation that Michael and Courtney created and borrowed a lot from their lists. But it was in late 2018, beginning of 2019, and I was having conversations down the hall with Chris about doing some events that were more inclusive, because I felt like, the general space was not as inclusive as it should be. And Chris was like, well, we have emerging tech. That would be the perfect opportunity for you to do this. So, this really also came from when I would attend various meetings in the public interest space, or like meetings on the Hill at the FCC, or events that corporations were having. I noticed a lot of times that I was one of 2 or one of 3 people of color in the room, and oftentimes there were conversations that people were having about broadband access and adoption, algorithmic bias, misinformation and disinformation, and that relates to communities of color, but those voices were not in the room. So in beginning of 2019, I published a blog on PK's website called #TechPolicySoWhite. And I talked about the lack of diversity in the tech policy space and the ways that we can change that. One of those ways being through the fellowship program at PK. I was hoping that, I know that other organizations have started to do that, and that's great. And it's fellowships with meaningful pay, right? Not paying someone $20,000 a year to be a fellow. And also having, various panels that have people of color represented. And so from there, again, I went ahead and took the reins of Emerging Tech, called it Emerging Tech for Social Change. And we had various panels throughout the day, like Chris mentioned, panel related to IoT and cybersecurity, AI and data privacy in communities of color, 3D printing and virtual reality. But we also had an HBCU logo design competition, and we gave that prize to a Howard University School of Communications student. We had a professor that taught at Norfolk State University. She now is at Texas Southern University, Dr. Morgan Kirby, that came there and talked to us about the importance of recruiting from HBCUs. Virginia Lamb Abrams was there from Starry. She talked about broadband access and adoption in urban communities. And we also had Lindsay Parker. She's the Chief Technology Officer for Washington, D.C. there as well, because despite the fact that a lot of folks live and work in DC, we don't talk a lot about, DC policy issues and DC politics. So it was great to hear from her as well. And later we had a great reception at Google. Shout out to Chanel Hardy, head of civil rights at Google, for hosting us there, where people were actually able to, see the technology in person. And it was a great time. Those were the before COVID times. And I'm excited for us to be able to do this again in person one day.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, you talked about, you dropped just a few names of what was, I think, definitely the most diverse, but also one of the most interesting group of panelists, participants. Our hardcore 3D DC and emerging tech audience was represented and showed up, but we had a fantastic crowd at your event. Tell us a bit about the change you made before the event. I know you did some interviews in advance, all as a way of centering voices that couldn't always show up and attend at the event.
Yeah, so we actually went up to New York, and we were at the YouTube studios there in New York, and interviewed a lot of amazing people. I think Michelle just put the video in the chat, but it was really just great to have diverse perspectives. And a lot of times in the tech space, we do focus a lot on the doom and gloom, which is, rightfully so. But it's also great to see the way that these technologies, can be used to transform people's lives, such as with, like 3D printing, like Courtney said. I also didn't know anything about 3D printing before this, but being able to see the way that this can be used for like prosthetics for people with disabilities was amazing to see. And to be able to see that in person was great as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, please, if you're on the Zoom, these are wonderful links about the history of 3D printing, emerging tech, years of work that this group and others have done. And also, if you're watching, please send us any questions you have. Use the Q&A function, and we can select questions from there going forward here. But I'll keep the conversation going with this group. At least one more thing. Before I open it up to everybody. So, you were there during the heart of the broader emerging tech focus. It wasn't just 3D printing. And you did multi-day event. You did recordings at a time, and you got to dive into the technology of artificial intelligence. You got to talk about how it impacts communities of color. How do you see that issue evolving over time? Because it feels like it's very in vogue now, but folks were just really starting to bring that topic to Washington.
Yeah. So yeah, that was one of my favorite panels of the day. And during that time, specifically related to privacy and AI. A lot of times, various panels and events that were taking place in DC, and there was a lot of, that privacy was taking up all the oxygen, I feel like, during that time, and rightfully so. But again, a lot of those conversations didn't specifically focus on communities of color, even if there were people of color present on the panels. I don't think that those questions were being asked as much as they needed to be. And so this was kind of my way of centering voices at the margins. And I do believe that now, due to, advocacy from, organizations like PK, incredible work of academics, and even, folks in the media, it's now widely understood, the various harms associated with data practices and AI systems, whether that be related to what jobs people can see, what, housing opportunities people can see, voter suppression and things of that sort. And I would say a lot of elected officials, from federal, state, and even local level are a lot smarter, around these issues, and they understand these issues a lot more. And we see that with legislation that's being introduced, or various hearings that take place, or even, like the banning of facial recognition technology in localities. So I think that we have come a long way. It's definitely more, mainstream, but I do think that, in order for us to kind of solve the problem, we all have to first understand the problem, be on the same page, right? Come to a consensus in order for us to, mitigate harms with these technologies.
Fantastic. So over time, from Michael's early work all the way through the wonderful groups that Elisa was bringing together and organizing this, we really enjoyed, I know as a staff, getting to know the community that would turn out for the event, that would advocate on their own behalf in Washington by coming. And it was a group that came from different walks of life. So tell me about the crowd. Maybe there's specific participants that you remember fondly. What do you think people got out of attending the conference? And I'll add a third question. What did you get out of attending and getting to know this audience that we don't interact with every day in Washington? Any of you can answer that. Yeah.
I can jump in, and I do want to say before answering your question, it's really exciting to see how this program that PK runs has evolved and moved to this place where it's sort of really focusing on emerging tech for the purpose of emerging tech, right? Like no technology remains emerging forever. And so it makes sense to think about it as a place to identify what's coming next. And public knowledge is not a trade association, right? It doesn't really have anything invested in any one technology. And so it's really well positioned as an organization to say, hey, there's this new technology coming. Here are some reasons to be interested in it and some upsides, but also here are some downsides. Here are some potential problems, right? There's no reason for PK to kind of hide those things. And so it's a really fantastic opportunity to present these new technologies, these emerging technologies on terms that really helps you us in the community and policymakers think through it. But anyway, to answer your actual question.
You're right, Michael. We want to center the people and their needs, and there's pluses and minuses for the average tech user. So yeah, talk about those people.
Yeah, so I mean, the people were great, right? So these are people who, generally speaking, were working in emerging technologies, and so for a lot of them, this was a real sense of validation for them. They were sort of surprised. They're surprised that people in Washington would care, right? They'd go to the Hill and talk to members of Congress. We did a couple of White House meetings. And for them, it was really satisfying because they felt like they were being taken seriously and that people were really interested in what was going on. I mean, I remember one year for 3DDC, whenever there's stuff going on in the Hill, you're always competing with other events. And one year, 3DDC was competing with both the Craft Brewers Association annual meeting and I don't even know, it was like the Giveaway Puppies for Free Association or something. It was, maybe it's the Humane Society. So there was like free beer. Yeah, it was like free beer in one place and like a bunch of puppies running around another place. But people were still really coming and excited about 3DDC because they wanted to understand these technologies. And so for the attendees who were from the community, it was a real eye-opening experience for them to feel like the kinds of things they were working on really did have the potential to make an impact. And for the policymakers who came, it was their chance to ask questions of people who were knowledgeable and who didn't necessarily have a kind of additional agenda and who were willing to answer, especially kind of early in the development of the technology, who were really happy to answer questions kind of as they saw it, because they didn't have talking points, they didn't have kind of an agenda they were pushing. They were just excited about the technology and excited to explain all the different ways that it could be used. So it felt like a really worthwhile experience for everyone. I think that's why we saw that the communities grew up around it. And as you sort of shift that into the emerging technology more broadly, it's just that system that allows you to bring new technologies in and connect them with everyone and give everyone a chance to just sort of get to know each other in an environment where questions are really welcome and people are really willing to explain what they see coming in the future without necessarily knowing all of the policy implications of those visions.
Courtney, was the same for you, or?
Yes, for sure. I think at a high level, there was absolutely this sense of camaraderie that 3DDC gave its participants, a feeling of, yes, you can reach out to a legislator and sit down and share your story about the implications of certain tech policies or technologies on your work and your craft and your community. So to jump ahead to what I learned, that was something I was learning right alongside those members of the 3D printing community who we were hosting. And specifically, I always think about this brother-sister duo. Chris, I'm sure you remember them well. Their names were Becky and John Button, and they were maybe 13 and 9. And they were super into 3D printing, and they'd attended events in the past and so on. And in getting to know them, I realized that they really had something compelling to say. So I put them on panels. Like, why not? Like, if we are going to talk about 3D printing and STEAM education, I think, Chris, you might have moderated that one.
That was mine, yeah.
Yeah, like, why not hear from a student or two, So it was just being able to kind of insert these really valuable and diverse perspectives in getting them all in the same room. And you hear how the conversation is elevated as a result. And so for Becky and John, for them, I think and hope that they got out of the event in understanding that their points of view matter and can be viewed by powerful adults as legitimate and impactful.
Yeah, the buttons, it was so cool to see, in their own just words and their own emotions, what it's like to discover. And that's what they were doing by going to their makerspace that they had access to in their community. It was really cool. Elisa, any thoughts on the people that showed up?
Yeah, I think PK always does a good job of bringing out, a great crowd, because you all are a well-respected, tech policy advocacy organization. But, having the event on the Hill was great, for us to be able to even interact with Hill staffers who may find it difficult to go to an event that's, in DuPont Circle or whatever the case may be. So I know I was able to meet a lot of great Hill staffers that day. And it was also really cool to see, after Lindsay Parker, the DC CTO, spoke, the amount of people that were outside waiting to talk to her afterwards, right? Like, that's just not someone that we would typically include in these conversations for whatever reason. We forget about DC despite living in DC. And so it was really cool to see that. And also it was great to see even the amount of people that were talking to Dr. Morgan Kirby after she was talking about the importance of recruiting from HBCUs. So seeing that, it kind of like, validated my thinking about the importance of like bringing those people into the conversation. So it was great.
Yeah. The first impression that I had of 3DDC, the first time I went to it, I think it was the second one that you ran, Michael, or the second one after Open Hardware. And I'll never forget, we did the traditional panels, we did the traditional reception, kind of post-work reception. If you've never been to a 3DDC or emerging tech event, it's like a little science fair where you can come up and touch the technology, which is really fun when you're talking about virtual reality or talking about 3D printed objects. I'll never forget, I didn't know he was a member of Congress, but there was a member of Congress who used to be a science teacher, and he was walking past, didn't know the event was going on, but just strolled in because he said, "Oh, I always wanted one of these devices in my office." And I was like, "Fantastic! We're so glad you came." And that was the great thing about being on Capitol Hill. The congressional staff, but even members of Congress would stop by because it was fun and it was interesting, and they could learn about the technology. So very, very cool.
Yeah. Chris, I think that having that tactile dimension was really valuable. And I remember meeting with a professor of archaeology who actually scanned fossils and would make files out of them that you could print. And I just like think of the experience that his students have where they're able to have that tactile dimension to the learning experience. Not to mention the fact that the professor could then share the files with other academic institutions and democratize access to this, which is often inaccessible to many. So he really represented the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great educational opportunities there. The museum community, always an active participant in our, especially this 3D printing part of emerging tech events. Let me ask Michael you a question, because there was a controversy a couple years into the 3D printing discussion, and it was probably the time we got most involved with legislation because of an emerging tech or 3D printing event, and that was around 3D printed guns. So let's just talk about it head on. Where did that come from, and what became of public knowledge's affiliation to gun issues? I mean, not something we usually talk about.
Yeah, no, it definitely was not something that I ever thought I would do have any professional connection with. I think it was an issue that came out, and depending on who you talk to, it was some combination of concern that people could be manufacturing guns at home. And this idea at the moment where, at that moment where 3D printing was getting a lot of attention, that this would be a way that somebody could, download files from the internet and then print out a gun and, go do horrible things with it. And so there was sort of that concern. And then that concern was also, from a timing standpoint, was matching a moment where members of Congress were looking to renew existing legislation about undetectable firearms, which itself had actually grown out of, as far as anyone could tell me, had grown out of that Clint Eastwood, John Malkovich movie, In the Line of Fire, where he had smuggled in a plastic gun, essentially. And so I think it was a little bit of a kind of, the meeting of these two trends to try and push this legislation forward. And at the time, Public Knowledge as an organization has no position on gun control. It's not what we do. And so we sat down with the members of Congress and their staff who were pushing it, and we said, look, we don't have a dog in the larger fight, but you should really think about how you're crafting this legislation, and how much you want to single out not just 3D printing, but any technology for this bill, because you should know, and because we as an organization have now been working with the maker community and with the open source hardware community. There's actually, there's a lot of technologies that you can use to manufacture products at home, and a lot of technology you could use to make a plastic firearm potentially at home. And so what we really did was work to educate those members and their staff, and to say, if your concern is an undetectable firearm, really focus the bill language on the undetectability. And you really shouldn't care about how the weapon was made so much as because the thing that you're worried about right now is that it's undetectable. And so if you set up these kind of technology specific triggers, first of all, we had a concern that it was going to unnecessarily single out one technology. But I think the other, probably more important problem is if you define the problem in a technology specific way, if someone comes along and reproduces a way to create undetectable firearms without using a 3D printer, you've missed the problem that you're trying to push back on. And so I think they were open to that conversation. And ultimately, because we had experience in the community, not just sort of in organizing them, but because as an organization, we'd been talking to them and we understood some of the nuances, we ultimately were able to convince the policymakers, the members of Congress, to sort of pull that 3D printing specific language out, and instead focus on the primary part of the bill. And so I think it was a win from the standpoint of, and it validated the idea that as an organization, especially for technology that was really emerging, Public Knowledge is well positioned to understand that technology and to work as an advocate and a broker in some ways between the emerging community and policymakers, with the knowledge that that technology is probably going to graduate out of the world of PK, right? I mean, there is no reason that public knowledge, needs to continue to be the only representative of any of the technologies in the emerging tech for social change portfolio or anything like that. There's kind of a moment in that technology's rise that it's really important for a public interest organization to be able to say, we have familiarity with it. But that's not the same as saying, we are now going to represent this one technology or advocate even for or against this one technology for its entire life cycle. I mean, that's not the role of PK.
Elisa, Courtney, I'm trying to remember, were there any pieces of legislation that you felt like were really connected to the emerging tech events while you were running them?
There wasn't anything that specific during 2016 and 2017. The big thing for us was that most, if not all, of our advocates had not done this before. So they weren't part of the earlier groups in earlier years. So the way we sort of approached it is these are skills that they can replicate at the local level. So helping them hone in on what their story is and thinking through how you maybe tweak your story a little bit depending on whose office you're sitting in, and researching ahead of time what it is that this member really cares about and what are the demographics of their constituency, that sort of thing, whether it's putting it in terms of, the conversation in terms of jobs created or, really you name it. So it was a really interesting kind of developmental skills-based initiative, I think, at least in 2016 and 2017.
And Elisa, I know you already mentioned how the privacy debate was really ramping up in Washington when you ran Emerging Tech DC, or Emerging Tech for Social Change. How do you view where the conversation around algorithmic decision making and AI is going these days? Do you get to deal with that in your current job, or?
So I'm mostly focused on broadband access and adoption, as well as prison phone rates in my current job. But I would say, just like kind of holistically, that it's great to see, but I guess like unfortunately it took a pandemic and the murder of George Floyd for us to people as a whole, a majority, to focus on issues of equity and justice, right? But I think that some of the things that I didn't even think necessarily were possible, like in 2019, such as like the emergency broadband benefit, the fact that people can get a $50 discount on broadband, I did not see that in 2019. So seeing that people are on board and there are bipartisan efforts to make sure that people have access to broadband, that's great to see. But I think that we all have to be like committed to long-term efforts of equity and justice, and not just when it's trendy. So I do think that there are efforts we're making our way. I think last year definitely accelerated these efforts.
So Chris, I have a question for you. Oh, sorry.
No, please. What can I answer?
I have a question for you, and probably a little bit Lisa as well, is that, we think about emerging tech for social change. There's plenty of places in Washington, on the internet, wherever, where you can kind of get exposed to emerging technology for the sake of exposing yourself to emerging technology. But as a public interest organization, one of PK's strengths and abilities is to be able to link these ideas of emerging technologies that have so much potential and potential downsides with the importance of social change and social good. And so I wonder, probably Chris, as thinking about it in the context of PK more broadly, Elisa, probably in your specific experience of organizing the event, how do you think about the process of tying those two things together, of tying not just, whiz-bang stuff for the purpose of talking about whiz-bang stuff, but really trying to tie it to a more substantive agenda and a more socially productive agenda?
Well, first of all, we should call it whiz-bang stuff.
It's all whiz-bang.
Yeah. No, Elisa, I'm curious what you would say, because I'm very interested in the idea of making, we tried to make the technology understandable and relatable. That was part of the driving force of the original event. But I think we're at our strongest when we can also connect its importance to folks' everyday lives, and that can be positive, that can be negative. And so, it's very popular in Washington these days to talk about how every kind of policy is technology policy. And so, because technology is infused into so many different parts of our lives. And so, that can be cliche, but people say it because the adoption rate of new technologies, including the four that we focused on in emerging tech, really is penetrated many communities. It's not everywhere. And so it really allows for a broader conversation where folks who may not have been open hardware geeks or makerspace members, are now talking about these technologies because they're using them. And they may not even know those terms, hacking and makerspace and Internet of Things, but they have Internet of Things devices in their home. They wear them on their body. And so, so the more that we can connect how people are actually living with them and using them, I think, and make that connection both ways for folks outside Washington and for folks inside Washington, and be that bridge. I think that's where we can have the greatest impact. Elisa, I don't know, how do you answer that question?
Yeah, I would say, even like connecting these, emerging or emergent technologies to, how it impacts, health outcomes, how they can, impact economic opportunity and that sort of a thing. I feel like that's truly important. Again, I just go back to the panelists that we had that had the prosthetics that was being used for like a small child. I just had never seen something like that, and to know that was made from a 3D printer was amazing. So yeah.
Great question, Michael. All right, I'm going to challenge each one of you now to share. We talked about how we had the science fair type event, and I think every 3D DC or emerging tech event had that portion of it. What was the coolest, the most interesting use of one of the emerging technology topics that you hadn't seen before at our event, or that you hadn't gotten to see or touch up close? Which one really was unforgettable to you? Anyone?
I think I already answered it. I keep talking about the prosthetics.
The prosthetics, you did say that, yeah. So maybe Courtney and Michael, yeah.
Yeah, the prosthetics was up there for me too. We ended up inviting this designer named Francis Battanti, who had designed this famous 3D printed dress for Dita Von Teese that she wore on a red carpet. And he ended up really leaning into 3D printing design and created back braces for people with scoliosis and that were kind of fashionable, or at least devices that the folks who use the device would feel was more conducive to their daily lives. So he really had this kind of person first approach to design, and marrying the arts side of it, which was of course right up my alley, with the technology itself. I just think he struck me as one of those people like no one else really thinks like him, so it was just really wonderful. I think we had him both years. And I've been following his work since, and he's just doing really wonderful things. So his work in that space, I would say, was a highlight for me.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a million things jump out. I think two things that are worth mentioning. One is we had a professor named Jordan Miller, who's now at Rice, and he does bioprinting. And so what he was showing off, and this is Jordan, if you're watching this, I'm sorry if I get this wrong. But basically, it is if you are a science person, it is pretty easy to grow in a lab a super thin layer of human skin and human tissue. But as you make it thicker, you have this problem where you can't get blood, which is all the nutrients and oxygen, to the cells that are in the middle layer of your strip of tissue. And so this is what blood vessels are for. And so he was using a modified 3D printer to build these really complex vasculatures out of sugar, where it looked like a kind of a web. And then you would print the vasculature out of sugar and put it in an auger where all the cells would grow around the vasculature. And then you could pull it out and like clear out the 3D printed bits. So there was then the voids for the blood vessels. So then you could pump blood through these like much thicker pieces of synthetic human tissue and keep them alive. And it was just like every step of that, from modifying a 3D printer to be able to print in sugar, which you could then also use it to print like cake toppers and all sorts of things, because you could just print crystal, these like glass looking crystal things. But then like thinking about really addressing these complex problems with a technology that basically the reason he could do it is because the technology had become cheap enough that if he broke the first couple, it wouldn't like blow his budget for the whole year. So that was one that I think was really interesting and really changed the breadth of how I thought about the technology. The other one was the team from the Smithsonian, right? And they were doing this incredible work of 3D scanning things, and then at the time, printing them. Also, they've been real leaders in open access, which is another, which is, you think about the kind of tree of issues that come out of these emerging technologies. It's like a whole world of PK stuff. But they've been real leaders on open access, on making those files available to people and letting you can 3D print your own version at home. You can explore them in 3D viewers and just make them all much more accessible. I remember one time they were showing me, they had 3D scanned a mummy in like a CAT scan machine, right? Some like giant thing. And there was still wrapped up in the mummy, there was like a necklace and a pendant that had been wrapped up in the mummy for whatever, 3,000 years. And they were able to extract the geometry of the necklace, of the pendant, and 3D print it. And so this thing that had never, and then put it, like, make it totally available. So it's like this thing that had existed and continues to exist, but had not been seen by people for thousands of years, was suddenly like very tactile and very there, thanks to the work that they were doing. And that was another example of just taking the technology and applying it in directions that I certainly would not have thought of, would not have occurred to me, but they were really fantastic and that really had a broader application.
Those are great ones. I will never forget the sugar vascular system as well. I was going to mention the combination of two of our emerging technologies and the potential for them. And it would be interesting to follow up with one of our participants, but folks, we had a panelist and an exhibition member that pulled dual duty from historic Jamestown, Virginia. And they were scanning and 3D printing artifacts like Courtney described. But I'll never forget, because we had the virtual reality folks there and the digital imaging that is consistent between the two technologies, she was talking about in the future how they'd love to not just scan artifacts, but to build scans of what Jamestown was like back at the time of the founding of Jamestown, the founding of the colonists there, so that you could then transport those into virtual reality designs. And again, just another way of broadening the educational and historical documenting possibilities of the technology. I don't know if they ever got there, but it was the sort of thing that they were imagining doing with the technology. So fantastic, a great participant. I think that might have been Courtney's second year that she was there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I should say that's one thing that we've actually seen, nothing good comes of COVID, but one thing that has happened is as 3D scanning has been used in more and more institutions, and there's been more and more interest in creating virtual spaces to get together, we have seen an acceleration in those 3D artifacts, those 3D environments being like that dream basically coming true and making it easier for people to experience those spaces, whether it's in virtual reality wearing goggles and everything, or just in a browser, and be able to see not just the one-off artifacts or the buildings or whatever it is, but see them in context, in historical context, in a way that you can experience it, kind of firsthand, which has been really amazing. And I think that flows from public knowledge issues, right? This like 3D scanning part of it and the open access part of it, and using the technology to bring more information to more people.
Right. I also want to shout out the VR Lab folks, probably getting the name wrong, but from up in the Boston area, who were trying to and did create a public access virtual reality studio in the way that we had public access television in the past, so that you could lower the barrier of entry to create your own community TV show. Doesn't matter, you didn't need to be rich, you could just use the community resource. They were doing the same thing for virtual reality. So very cool to make sure that all parts of the community got to participate and create virtual media. Fantastic work. Well, we're almost out of time, folks. I could nerd out on this all day long. You guys know that about me. I love these topics. I really appreciate the three of you coming back to help us look backward. Real quick, each of you, please share for our audience remind them, I gave your titles, but tell them what you're actually doing and where they can follow you online. Let's start with Elisa and then go on our reverse order.
Yeah, so I'm the special advisor to FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks. Today actually marks my 2 years of working in his office, but you can follow me online at Elisa Valentine, everywhere, LinkedIn, Twitter, everything. But I, again, work on broadband access and adoption issues, and I am kind of our event planner by accident in our office. And so I've organized the commissioner's HBCU presidents roundtables, future of work events, Latinx Digital Divide, Black mental health. Also helped him get started with his early career staff diversity initiative. So there's definitely a line from my work at PK to the work that I'm doing in Commissioner Stark's office. But as always, it's great to be with the PK family. Great to meet Courtney and Michael. I haven't met you all before, and great to see you again, Chris.
Yeah, well, we love that you're using those event skills. Courtney?
Sure. So I am at a company called Patreon. I'm on their policy team. Patreon's a creator-founded membership platform and really a pioneer of the creative economy. So we're getting creators paid, in short. Creators on Patreon earned $1 billion last year alone. And right now they're getting like 100 million on a monthly basis, which feels like so far away from where things were when I was running 3DDC. This idea that creators are finally valued for the value that they bring is really a wonderful time to be at a place like Patreon. So we've taken sort of an unorthodox approach to policy development that reflects the fact that it's 2021 and creators are rightfully and finally in the driver's seat. So that informs what we do every day. Chris, I really appreciate the chance to be on a panel with Elisa and Michael, and echo Elisa's thanks for the whole PK team. My handle on Twitter is at cduffy90.
Fantastic. Great to have you back. Michael, 30 seconds.
Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at NYU. We do it with what it says in the tin. We do law stuff for innovation, law, and policy. Come on up. We're in New York. I will say, if I only have 10 seconds left, we are hiring fellows who are, fellowship is designed to complement your full-time job. So check that out. And we're also hiring a program manager full-time job. So this PK crowd should fit in with both of those things. So come on down. My Twitter is mweinberg2d, because unlike 3D printing, Twitter is a 2D medium.
Fantastic. It's so good to see all of you. the hour's wrapping up. We got to close it out, but we do want to remind folks that you can check out the series online on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to the Public Knowledge YouTube channel. Check out all of our historical videos there. Fantastic stuff. You can find young Michael Weinberg in some of those from like 10 years ago. Sorry, Michael.
Michael Weinberg with hair is on those videos.
And coming up, we have more to do in our 20th anniversary. We have our annual IP3 Awards. Please check it out. Come participate. Help us celebrate wonderful people that we're honoring at the IP3 Awards in September. And we also have still open our nominations for our 20 leaders in technology, emerging leaders in technology that we'll be doing towards the end of the year. So a lot of great 20th anniversary stuff still to come. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll